So it's the new year. It's a time of great significance. I don't know about you. I always very conscious, as I said in the midweek reflection, that you get very excited on the 31st of December, 1st of January, then everything seems much the same. So why is it we get so excited about the new year? Some of us, anyway. I'll let you into a secret. My parents weren't very excited about New Year at all. And when I was about 12, they went to bed about 10 o'clock. And at 11:30 at night, I sneaked out of the house and walked about 2 miles to a friend's house, saw the New Year in with them, and then came back. And I've looked back on my life and thought, of all the things I've done in my life, this was probably one of the most stupid things. If my parents had woken up in the night, discovered I wasn't there, I hate to think what they would have done. So I tell you that. We had confession earlier. I shall obviously have to have another time of confession later. But at that point, I thought it was really important to celebrate New Year. Well, I found an article in Psychology Today. You can see I go to the highest sources, by a man called David Ropick. He'd investigated why was it that New Year carried such special symbolism. And there's a whole long article here. I'll pick out some of the highlights. He points out it is common around the world, and it's been going for as long as there's been calendars, like that big one at Stonehenge. It may be that the symbolism, he says, we attach to this moment is rooted in one of the most powerful motivations of all, our motivation to survive. Interesting. The celebration part is obvious, he says, as our birthdays do. New Year's Day provides us the chance to celebrate, having made it through another 365 days, the unit of time by which we keep chronological score of our lives. Phew, another year over, he says, and here we still are. Time to raise our glasses and toast our survival. And he points out it's also the time of year when we read the obituaries of those who didn't get through to that moment. And then people make resolutions. What about resolutions? He says, aren't they about survival too, living healthier, better, longer? We seem at the new year to want to keep going, so we want to make things better in our lives. And he points out it's something to do with having control over what lies ahead. And I found this was really interesting. He says the future is unsettlingly unknowable. And I think this year, more than ever before, things change day by day. Will the children be able to go back to school? Will I be able to go back to work? Will I be working from home? The future is unsettlingly unknowable. Not knowing what's to come means we don't know what we need to know to keep ourselves safe. To counter that powerlessness, we do things to take control. We resolve to diet and exercise. You can see I've done that so many times. We decide to quit smoking and to start saving. It doesn't matter whether we hold our resolve and make good on these promises. Committing to them, at least for a moment, gives us a sense of feeling in control over the uncertain days to come. And then he quotes a 2007 study by a British psychologist that found for many of us what U2 sang is true. Nothing changes on New Year's Day. Of 3,000 people followed for a year, 88% failed to achieve the goals of their resolutions, although 52% had been confident when they made them. I wonder if that reflects your experience. Then he says, interesting, New Year's resolutions always commonly include things like treating people better, making new friends, and paying off debts. It's been so throughout history. The Babylonians would return borrowed objects on New Year's Day. Jews seek and offer forgiveness. The Scots go first footing, visiting neighbours to wish them well, and hopefully, presumably, to treat them well for the rest of the year. And he says, how does this social resolving connect to survival? We're social animals. We have evolved to depend on others, literally, for our health and safety. Treating people well is a good way to be treated well. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I wonder where he found that quote. It's a great survival strategy, he says. And many people resolve to pray more. That makes sense in terms of survival too. Pray more, and an omnipotent force is more likely to keep you safe. Jews pray at the start of their new year to be inscribed in the book of life for one more year. Pray more, and death is less scary. There are hundreds of good luck rituals, he says, woven among New Year celebrations, also practiced in the name of exercising a little control over fate. The Dutch, for whom the circle is a symbol of success, eat donuts. Now there's a New Year tradition I could get into. Greeks bake special cakes with a coin inside, bestowing good luck in the coming year on whoever finds it in his or her slice. Fireworks on New Year's Eve started in China millennia ago as a way to chase off evil spirits. The Japanese hold New Year's Bonenkai, or Forget the Year parties, to bid farewell to the problems and concerns of the past year and prepare for a better one. Disagreements and misunderstandings between people are supposed to be resolved and grudges set aside. In a New Year's ritual for many cultures, houses are scrubbed to sweep out the bad vibes and make room for better ones. But it's now the 3rd of January, you've obviously already done that. So he finishes the article by saying, how do you reassure yourself against the scariest thing the future holds, the only sure thing that lies ahead, the inescapable reality that you will someday die? And his suggestion is, pass the donuts, the Greek cake and the grapes, light the fireworks, and raise a glass to toast to survival. Well, as Christians, we don't look to articles in psychology today for advice. We look to the Word of God. And so we're going to think a little bit about what the Bible has to say on this subject of looking back and looking forward. And here's a picture of the Greek god Janus. He's the god of gateways and beginnings, and he's the one who gave his name to January. You see, you learn all sorts of wonderful things when you join our services. So we're going to start by looking back. That's one of the ways Janus looks. He looks back. And when we look back, we remember. I don't know what you've thought about as you've looked back over 2020. There's probably quite a lot of things you prefer to forget. There's also been some things that are worth remembering. And I hope you've been able to remember those things that are positive from the past year, even amidst all the difficulties that so many of us have faced. I'm always intrigued that when you get to the Bible, it tells you to remember Lot's wife. Now, I'm fairly sure that since January the 1st, you haven't remembered Lot's wife. It hasn't been a constant source of thought for you. Why did Jesus tell people to remember Lot's wife? Well, she was being rescued. She was being given an opportunity to escape from judgment, and she was given one instruction: whatever you do, don't look back. And what did she do? She looked back. As Sodom was being destroyed behind her, she looked back, and she was turned, we're told in the Bible, into a pillar of salt. Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. When we don't look back, when we should be pressing forward. She struggled to be wholehearted in commitment and obedience. And part of the challenge of a new year for us as Christians is not just to make a resolution to be better people, but to build our confidence that we can trust God and look to His Spirit to guide us and to lead us. And we can look forward confident that our future is in His hands and we can press on. Then I love this verse. The Israelites started wailing and said, here they are. They've been rescued too. They're in the desert and they've been rescued. But what do they think about? They remember, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions and garlic. I get the impression that they were the people of God and they all started thinking about the best meals they'd ever had in Egypt. And one said, oh, the melons were good. And somebody said, yeah, what about the cucumbers? And here they were in the middle of this desert, remembering the good old days. Yeah, well, we were slaves, yeah, but at least we had decent food to eat. And hey, the onions were just fantastic. So they remembered, but they had a very selective memory. And it was pointed out later on, Moses said, remember, you were slaves in Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you. And I think one of the important things about a new year, as we look back and we remember, as Christians, what we are asked to remember is that God has been active in our lives. For those of us who put our faith and trust in Jesus, there's the promise that He's with us. And sometimes when difficulties come, and when doubts arise and we're not sure that He's with us, then it's really important to be able to remember what God has done for us. I remember when I used to occasionally be involved at somewhere like Spring Harvest, and people would have a very meaningful encounter with God's Spirit at an event like that. And I would always encourage them to open the Bible and to write down what God had done for them, what God had said to them. Because I knew that one of the realities of life is that in a week's time or a month's time or a year's time, we said, did God really say that? Did God really do that? And we need sometimes a help to remember. And so I always thought it was helpful if they opened their Bibles, they would see, on that day, in that year, God said this, or God did this for me. Some people, some of you watching, can look to the day when God came and entered your life by his Spirit, and Jesus came into your life as you sought forgiveness for your sins and you committed yourself to follow him. You know the date. You can look back and you can remember that took place. It's important to remember what God has done for us. And here's another item about remembering. This is Samuel. He took a large stone and placed it between the towns of Mizpah and Jeshanah. He named it Ebenezer, the stone of help, for he said, up to this point, the Lord has helped us. Now, you can tell from looking at me, I'm of a certain age. I'm now in the year when I'm going to reach the age which is relevant to when I caused a family moment, when I told my father on his 35th birthday that he was now middle-aged. Because being an unpleasant little boy, I'd worked out that he was supposed to live to 70, and if he got to 35, he got halfway there, so he was now middle-aged. So I'm about to reach the point where I would have been middle-aged 35 years ago. And when I was younger, very young, we used to sing a hymn. And it had this wonderful line, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer." And I wasn't sure I ever was able to hear that being sung without giggling, because I was, a mature young man. And in many ways, I'm about as mature now as I was then. But here's the point of the song. Some of you know it comes from the hymn, "Come thou fount of every blessing." "Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He, to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood." We've remembered that in the communion. And communion was set up to help us remember. And it came out of the Passover, which had been set up to help the people of God remember that God had rescued them. I wonder if some of you, it might even be helpful, not to find a stone as big as the one in the picture, but maybe to take a stone and put it in your garden or somewhere, and you can say, just as Samuel did, "This is my Ebenezer stone. This is to remind me that I've got this far with God's help." That might be a help to you during 2021. Here's the verses from the communion. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this to remember me." Jesus was anxious that we didn't forget what he'd done for us. Just as in the Passover, the people of God must remember, they had to tell the children, so the children learnt the story as to what God had done for them. It was so important to remember. So remembering is really important. But then there's things in the Bible about what we need to forget. One of the things that's really great is that God forgets our sin. "I will forgive their wickedness," it says in Hebrews, "and will remember their sins no more." Some of us have got really good memories for the things we've done wrong. Some of us carry the burden of the guilt that we feel because of something we did years ago. Maybe it was something even more stupid than setting out on New Year's Eve without telling your parents where you were going. And part of the message of the new year is that it's worth remembering that God has said he can forgive you. God has said he will forget what you have done in the past. And good advice can be that if God can forget and forgive, then you need to be able to forgive and forget yourself and move on. Maybe 2021 for you can be the year in which you move on from that guilt that you've carried. We said our prayer of confession. It's real. God does forgive and God does forget our sin. And then there's another verse that talks about forgetting. "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing." And it struck me this verse was a really helpful one and one to think about at the beginning of 2021. We've had a very difficult time. I don't want to underestimate some of the difficulties that you may have faced during this year. uncertainties about work, uncertainties about family. Some of you haven't seen people that you hold really dear for many, many months. It's not been easy at all. But the promise that God gives to each one of us is that he will do a new thing. And I don't think that's a promise specifically about vaccinations coming and making it easier for us to get on with life. I think it's a promise that God does a new thing in our life, almost regardless of what circumstances we find ourselves in, because he's with us, because he's promised to be with us. He stays with us. His Spirit is with us. He will do a new thing for us. I wonder what new thing you want God to do in your life. In one sense, advice might be, don't make a New Year's resolution with yourself, but make a request to God for him to intervene in your life, to make the difference that you want to make. There's a reference in that article to people who resolved to quit smoking. I tried to quit smoking for many, many times. And part of the answer came when I actually realized I couldn't do it by myself. I was addicted, and I had to ask God to help me. And he did. I haven't smoked a cigarette for a very, very long time. God can intervene in our lives by his Spirit, and he can help us to do the things that he wants to do, and that in our best moments we want to do in our lives. What new thing do you want God to do? God's Spirit is there to do new things in our lives. And then finally, the fact that New Year occurs in the Advent period encourages us to look forward to Jesus' return. In the communion service, the words in 1 Corinthians say, "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." In all the uncertainty about the future that we've been thinking about, there is one thing certain, that God has not given up on his planet, and he has promised that just as Jesus came the first time, he will return. Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. That's the promise that God gives us. And it's one that's important to maybe think about at the start of a new year. This was something I wrote in the book. Many of you have stuck with it through all the daily readings that I've been sending out. And if so, you've got to this bit very shortly. There is no full stop at the end of time. There is joy, there is peace, there's a wedding feast. Children may light the Advent candles and look forward to presents. The real Advent expectation is the light of his presence. Jesus promises to be with us by his Spirit now. In 2021, we are not alone. And he promises us to keep us. He promises to hold on to us. He promises to return for us. Our Master, Jesus Christ, is on his way. He'll show up right on time. His arrival guaranteed. One of the nicest days out we've had in the times when you could have days out, we met some friends in the town of Olney. And when we get the chance to go back to travelling about again, I recommend going to Olney. Olney was where Isaac Newton was the minister for a very, very long time. Isaac Newton was the man who'd been a slave trader on a ship, and he had a remarkable encounter with God. His faith strengthened, he became a minister, and he's probably best known for writing the words of Amazing Grace. But I wonder if you realise that he wrote Amazing Grace because he used to write hymns to illustrate sermons. I mean, I don't know what Steve Barber does each week. We've never had a new hymn for a sermon. But Isaac Newton would regularly write new hymns for a sermon. And this hymn that we now know as Amazing Grace, he wrote at the end of 1772 to be sung on the 1st of January 1773. And it wasn't called Amazing Grace, it was called Faith's Review and Expectation. I think that morning he preached a sermon on looking back and looking forward. And so there it comes. If you think through the words of the song, you'll realise he's talking about what God has done for him in the past. He's remembering the change that God had brought in his life. And he's looking forward to one day being able to worship God in heaven. Towards the end of his life, Isaac Newton got old, as we do, and his memory went, as some of our memories go, and he said this: "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things: that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great Saviour." We can look back on what God has done for us in Jesus, and we can look forward to the future with him, whatever that future may hold, because he has promised never to leave us and never to forsake us.